Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand. This book was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and it was very successful and popular, and renewed, I think, some interest in the Pragmatists. It came out in 2001, and it talks about four individuals. Those are Oliver Wendell Holmes, Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. And three of them, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Charles Peirce, and William James, were members of an organization called the Metaphysical Club. And they would share their ideas about philosophy and various things, young thinkers. And the book goes into detail about these four individuals' lives, in particular their lives as young men. Now, John Dewey is a somewhat odd inclusion. He was never in the Metaphysical Club, but he was associated with the others, and particularly associated with William James, and he was a pragmatist, and in some sense this book looks at the roots of pragmatism, so I can certainly see why they included him. But like I said, it's very much about their young lives, and so when pragmatism really begins to take off, that's kind of after a lot of the contents of the book. So the way the book's organized is that there are 5 parts. And the first 4 parts detail the 4 individuals. First, Oliver Wendell Holmes, then William James, then Charles Peirce, and then John Dewey. And then part 5 kind of summarizes some of the ideas of pragmatism, and it also talks about some of the outcomes of their ideas. It talks about the rest of their lives a little bit, how things unfolded for the 4 of them, and ties that in with their ideas, kind of talking about the consequences of their ideas on their lives and on their their society, on American society, how the ideas of these thinkers blossomed into the American consciousness. And it's actually the only section that I want to look at today is part 5. So the biographical stuff, I'm not as interested in. More interested here in some of their ideas. There's a little bit of biographical stuff in part 5 as well. And I want to talk in particular about some actual events that occurred that were involved with John Dewey's life. And I'll get to those in a little bit. But first, I want to look at it. What it does here is it sort of contrasts some of the varieties of different types of pragmatism. Like it looks at John Dewey's version of pragmatism compared to Charles Peirce's pragmatism, compared to William James's pragmatism. Looks a little bit at some of the differences between them. It doesn't get really into contrasting them, but it does a little bit touch on some of the differences between them. And those are the parts that I want to look at to help pin down a good, working, useful definition of pragmatism. I know I've touched on a lot of books on pragmatism, and I keep coming back to try to pin down the definition of it, and I think I've gotten pretty good of a definition explored in some of the prior books. But I do, as I've said before, I do think that both William James and John Dewey kind of go astray at points. And so I wonder, and I think Charles Peirce maybe it has the best version, although some of his ideas are a little sketchy as well. But I certainly wonder whether there could be another version of pragmatism that escapes the particular idiosyncrasies of these thinkers and gets maybe closer to a better, more accurate, and more useful version of pragmatism. So without any further ado, I'm going to get in, read a little bit from this. I always read a couple sections and provide a little bit of commentary, the sections that I think are most pertinent to the point of my podcast and to the modern world, and to help us understand how pragmatism can help us understand where we go from here. So let me jump in and read a little bit of an explanation about what pragmatism is, particularly what pragmatism is from William James's point of view. So he says, quote, Pragmatism is an account of the way people think, the way they come up with ideas, form beliefs, and reach decisions. What makes us decide to do one thing when we might do another thing instead? The question seems unanswerable, since life presents us with many types of choices and no single explanation can be expected to cover every case. Deciding whether to order the lobster or the steak is not the same sort of thing as deciding whether the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In the first case, assuming price is not an object, we consult our taste. In the second, we consult our judgment and try to keep our taste out of it. But knowing more or less what category a particular decision belongs to, knowing whether it is a matter of personal preference or a matter of impersonal judgment, doesn't make that decision any easier to make. Order what you feel like eating, says your impatient dinner companion, but the problem is that you don't know what you feel like eating. What you feel like eating is precisely what you are trying to figure out. Order what you feel like eating is just a piece of advice about the criteria you should be using to guide your deliberations. It is not a solution to your menu problem. Just as do the right thing and tell the truth are only suggestions about criteria, not answers to actual dilemmas. The actual dilemma is what, in the particular case staring you in the face, the right thing to do or the honest thing to say really is. And making those kinds of decisions about what is right or what is truthful is like deciding what to order in a restaurant, in the sense that getting a handle on tastiness is no harder or easier, even though it is generally less important, than getting a handle on justice or truth. People reach decisions most of the time by thinking. This is a pretty banal statement, but the process it names is inscrutable. An acquaintance gives you a piece of information in strict confidence. Later on, a close friend lacking that information is about to make a bad mistake. Do you betray the confidence? Do the right thing. But what is the right thing? Keeping your word, or helping someone you care about avoid injury and embarrassment? Even in this two-sentence hypothetical case, the choice between principles is complicated, as it always is in life, by circumstances. If it had been the close friend who gave you the information, and the acquaintance who was about to make the mistake, you would almost certainly think about your choice differently, as you would if you thought that the acquaintance was a nasty person, or that the friend was a lucky person, or that the statute of limitations on the secret had probably run out, or that you had acquired a terrible habit of betraying confidences and really ought to break it. In the end, you will do what you believe is right, but rightness will be, in effect, the complement you give to the outcome of your deliberations. Though it is always in view while you are thinking, what is right is something that appears in its complete form at the end, not the beginning of your deliberation. When we think, in other words, we do not simply consult principles, or reasons, or sentiments, or tastes, for prior to thinking all those things are indeterminate. Thinking is what makes them real. Deciding to order the lobster helps us determine that we have a taste for lobster. Deciding that the defendant is guilty helps us establish the standards of justice that apply in this case. Choosing to keep a confidence helps make honesty a principle, and choosing to betray it helps to confirm the value we put on friendship. Does this mean that our choices are arbitrary or self-serving, that standards and principles are just whatever is in our interest to say they are, pretexts for satisfying selfish ends or gratifying hidden impulses? There is no way to answer this question except to say that it rarely feels as though this is the case. We usually don't end up deciding to do what seems pleasant or convenient at the moment. Experience teaches us that this is rarely a wise basis for making a choice. If merely feeling good could decide, drunkenness would be the supremely valid human experience, as James once put it. When we are happy with the decision, it doesn't feel arbitrary. It feels like the decision we had to reach. And this is because its inevitability is a function of its fit with the whole inchoate set of assumptions of our self-understanding and of the social world we inhabit. The assumptions that give the moral weight, much greater moral weight than logic or taste could ever give, to every judgment we make. This is why, so often, we know we're right before we know why we're right. First we decide, then we deduce. It does not follow that it is meaningless to talk of beliefs being true or untrue. It only means that there is no non-circular set of criteria for knowing whether a particular belief is true, no appeal to some standard outside the process of coming to the belief itself. For thinking just is a circular process. in which some end, some imagined outcome, is already present at the start of any train of thought. Truth happens to an idea, James said in the lectures he published in 1907 as Pragmatism. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is, in fact, an event, a process, the process, namely, of its verifying itself. And elsewhere in the same lectures, the true is only the expedient in our way of thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in our way of behaving. Thinking is a free-form and boundless activity that nevertheless leads us to outcomes we feel justified in calling true or just or moral. James invented pragmatism, that is, he named his own philosophical views after a principle Peirce had published 20 years earlier in an article based on his Cambridge Metaphysical Club paper called How to Make Our Ideas Clear, in order to defend religious belief in what he regarded as an excessively scientific and materialistic age. That had not been part of Peirce's intention, though Peirce certainly believed that his principle was compatible with religious faith. But there was nothing eccentric about what James was doing. Defending religious belief was a task almost every 19th century scientist felt obligated to take on. Some did it by rejecting modern science, as Agassiz did. Some did it by drawing a bright line between science and faith, as Huxley did. Some did it by claiming that science and scripture were on the same page, as Hall did. James thought all these methods of defending religious belief were based on a mistaken understanding of the nature of belief, and he proposed to show that what science, specifically what the new psychology, had to say about how minds work, applies to the way people think about God as much as it does to the way they think about whether the world is round or what to have for dinner. End quote. So it remains a little hard to grasp hold of sometimes. The point here being that it's hard to pin down what it is we're using to evaluate certain things. In the most basic question of whether we want lobster or steak, we're trying to evaluate our taste, what we prefer, but what we prefer is really only determined once we make the decision that, well, I prefer lobster. And then you can say, well, I prefer lobster because I sensed that my preference was for lobster. But it's hard to pin down what the root is of decision-making and thinking. And the same thing with making some sort of a moral decision. He puts forward an example. If an acquaintance has given you a secret and wants you to keep this secret, but then a close friend of yours is going to make a blunder because they don't know this information, do you break the confidence of the acquaintance and share the information with your friend so they don't make the mistake? Or do you keep your word and not let someone's private secret spill out when you told them that you wouldn't when you wouldn't share the secret? What's the right thing to do? And there's a bunch of considerations. He says everything is contingent. Every decision is, in its own way, it's complicated by circumstances. And he says, in the end, you will do what you believe is right, but the rightness will be the complement you give to the outcome of your deliberations. You're going to kind of weigh these various things against one another. Do I want to be the sort of person who breaks promises? Is my friend lucky and he's going to make it through okay anyway? He doesn't really need to know this information. He'll be fine. You know, you make a series of different judgments. You've got certain desires as to what kind of person you want to be, and what the impact is going to be of your various courses of action, how it's going to make you look, how it's going to make your friend look, how much you care, how your friend looks, the various things that come into play, and ultimately you'll make a decision, and then you will sort of, after the fact, say, well, that was the right decision. After I weighed everything, I made the right choice. But it was only right because of the circumstances and because of what you personally valued and what you were trying to, the kind of person that you were trying to be. He says, does that mean that it's really all just arbitrary, or that it's all just self-serving, that we just make the choice that's going to paint us in the best light? Do we make the choice that's going to provide us with the most satisfaction? We evaluate the different circumstances, and then which one leaves me in a state of satisfaction with myself, satisfied with the kind of person I am, and then that's the choice I make, so that it's really all self-serving. He says it's hard to say. We don't usually feel that way, but I think in a sense there's some truth to that. We do act in our own self-interest. But to act in our own self-interest sometimes means maintaining a reputation for loyalty. Sometimes means maintaining a reputation for being a reliable friend who's not going to let your friend make a mistake. In some sense, your self-serving action is that you desire to be a person who has a decent reputation in society. You don't want to be known as someone who does this or that. And there's also, of course, the sort of feeling that you get of guilt if you do the wrong thing, and that's a sort of internal feeling, and we're trying to avoid that. So in a way, it's self-serving to avoid doing things that make you feel the unpleasant sensation of guilt. And he says, ultimately, the decision seems right because it fits in with all of the assumptions that you have about yourself and your world. It fits into your conceptions. It doesn't create dissonance. When you make a decision that creates dissonance with who you think you are or the way that you think the world works, then it doesn't feel like the right decision. So we're trying to make decisions that fit in with what we already know and what we already sense or intuit about ourselves and the world. And so in a way that's I think, important part of pragmatism is that when we believe something to be true, we believe it to be true because it fits in with the other things that we believe to be true, because we're trying to avoid believing contradictory things. So it's not necessarily the case that we just believe whatever is convenient for us at the time. You know, if you think that, you know, the some certain course of action will benefit you, then you would just sort of brand that course of action as the right course of action in order to justify your engaging in it, in order ultimately to gain the most benefit for yourself. Therefore, that was the right course of action, and all the suppositions and assumptions you made must be true because it benefits you. That's not really what pragmatism is. It's more that it's the things that are true are the things that create the least amount of cognitive dissonance in us because they conflict the least with our other beliefs. And he does talk about thinking as a sort of circular process. So there's some sort of outcome or end or point to the thought. He says there's no non-circular set of criteria for knowing whether a particular belief is true, no appeal to some standard outside the process of coming to the belief itself. I think that that really ought to be expanded a little bit. If you say that your belief is true because it fits in with your other beliefs, then your other beliefs, in a way, are external to this particular belief. It's not that one belief in one thing justifies itself without reference to anything else. It's that one belief has to fit with your other beliefs, and all of your beliefs taken as a whole, your whole concept of the way everything works, has nothing to refer back to. But you might say, well, of course it refers back to your experiences. It refers back to the things that you see in the world and your perceptions. Your beliefs have to conform with your perceptions. But of course, you could then turn around and say, well, what you believe that you perceived, your past perceptions are maintained in your memory, and you sort of believe that you've perceived those things, in the sense that your mind doesn't have any direct apprehension of the external world except mitigated by your perceptions and your senses. In that sense, all of your beliefs are sort of locked in a box, and they all refer to one another, and none of them really truly refer directly to the outside world. But I think that severely downplays the effect of perception. Pragmatism can get a little bound up, and not only pragmatism, but philosophy in general can get a little bound up in the distinction between what's inside the mind and what's outside the mind. Everything that is in your mind has in some way been influenced by the external world. I think that's where pragmatism probably needs to maintain its connection with common sense philosophy. Common sense philosophy puts a lot of value in the perceptions and the accuracy of perceptions and the ability of our mind really to connect with the external world, especially when you consider that our mind is the product of the matter that is, that constitutes our brain, and our brain has a direct connection to our nerves, which is where our sensory information comes in from. To the extent that the mind is an activity of a material object of the brain, there is actually a lot of connection with the material world. The mind is the product of the material world. Your brain is a part of the material world, and the connections from your brain to the outer world are seamless, effectively. So while I like pragmatism, I think that it always, especially in John Dewey's writings, can go a little bit too far and go into strange directions. It really should remain grounded in common sense philosophy. So anyway, let's move forward from there. He talks a little bit here about John Dewey's version of pragmatism, where he says, quote, "Dewey's pragmatism was a consequence of the success of the laboratory school. The school established for him the validity of his hypothesis that thinking and acting are just two names for a single process, the process of making our way as best we can in a universe shot through with contingency. It also showed him what was wrong with philosophy, and Dewey's career after Chicago can be divided into two parts. From his arrival at Columbia until the United States entered the war in 1917, he defended pragmatism against the arguments of other philosophers, frequently in the pages of the Journal of Philosophy founded in 1904 by two members of the Columbia faculty, the psychologist J. McKean Cattle and the chairman of the philosophy department, Frederick J. E. Woodbridge. From the war until the end of his life, he addressed the issues of his time in a pragmatist spirit. Philosophers, Dewey argued, had mistakenly insisted on making a problem of the relation between the mind and the world, an obsession that had given rise to what he called the alleged discipline of epistemology, the attempt to answer the question, how do we know? The pragmatist response to this question is to point out that nobody has ever made a problem about the relation between, for example, the hand and the world. The function of the hand is to help the organism cope with the environment. In situations in which a hand doesn't work, we try something else, such as a foot, or a fishhook, or an editorial. Nobody worries in these situations about a lack of some preordained fit, about whether the physical world was or was not made to be manipulated by hands. They just use a hand where a hand will do. Dewey thought that ideas and beliefs are the same as hands, instruments for coping. An idea has no greater metaphysical stature than, say, a fork. When your fork proves inadequate to the task of eating soup, it makes little sense to argue about whether there is something inherent in the nature of forks or something inherent in the nature of soup that accounts for the failure. You just reach for a spoon. But philosophers have worried about whether the mind is such that the world can be known by it, and they have produced all sorts of accounts about how the fit is supposed to work, how the mental represents the real. Dewey's point was that mind and reality, like stimulus and response, name non-existent entities. They are abstractions from a single, indivisible process. It therefore makes as little sense to talk about a split that needs to be overcome between the mind and the world as it does to talk about a split between the hand and the environment, or the fork and the soup. Things, he wrote, are what they are experienced as. Knowledge is not a copy of something that exists independently of its being known. It is an instrument or organ of successful action. The chief service of pragmatism, as regards epistemology, he wrote to a friend in 1905, will be to give the coup de grace to representationalism. Dewey regarded the tendency to ascribe a special status to the mind and its ideas as a reflection of class bias. The Greek philosophers belonged to a leisure class, and this made it natural for them to exalt reflection and speculation at the expense of making and doing, to talk about reasoning as something that transcends the circumstances of the being who reasons. Philosophy, since the Greeks, Dewey thought, amounted to a history of efforts to establish, in the interests of similar class preferences, the superiority of one element over the other in a series of false dichotomies. stability over change, certainty over contingency, the fine arts over the useful arts, what minds do over what hands do. The penalty was anachronism. While philosophy pondered its artificial puzzles, science, taking a purely instrumental and experimental approach, had transformed the world. Dewey believed that it was time for philosophy to catch up. Like James, he thought that pragmatism's insistence that ideas and beliefs are always in the service of interests, that the trail of the human serpent is over everything, as James put it, was the beginning of a philosophical revolution. The moment the complicity of the personal factor in our valuations is recognized fully, frankly, and generally, Dewey wrote a year after James's Pragmatism appeared, that moment a new era in philosophy will begin. When the British writer G.K. Chesterton complained, soon after, that pragmatism is a matter of human needs, and one of the first of human needs is to be something more than a pragmatist, Dewey was delighted. The remark spilled the personal milk in the absolutist's coconut, he said. For the objection that pragmatism's account of belief doesn't satisfy all our needs confirms pragmatism's most basic claim, which is that what people choose to believe is just what they think it is good to believe. Every philosophical account of the way people think is a support for those human goods the person making the account believes to be important. Dewey thought that recognizing this could help philosophers make a difference in the world. Philosophy recovers itself, he wrote in 1917 in a famous sentence in his essay, The Need for a Recovery of Philosophy, when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men. End quote. Now here, in Dewey's version of pragmatism as described here, this sounds awfully correct. This sounds, I like this description of pragmatism in comparing the mind to how the hand is. The mind is a function of the body. Grasping things, poking things, lifting things are functions of the hand. We use those functions to accomplish things just like we use the functions of the mind to accomplish things. It's a biological phenomena that exists in order to help us make our way through the world. We've evolved to have hands. We've evolved to have brains. We've evolved to have minds. And evolution only gives us what it is useful to have in some way or another, either useful in surviving or useful in procreating. Evolution doesn't really tend to provide us, except perhaps in certain circumstances accidentally, doesn't really tend to provide us with things that don't benefit us. That the evolutionary process wouldn't generate things, and those things generated wouldn't achieve long-term stability and spread throughout the human species if they weren't helpful. And so the mind is just like that. It's a biological phenomena, and it exists because it helps us make our way in the world in the same way that a hand does. And sometimes the hand is not the right tool, and sometimes the mind is not the right tool. And I think Dewey in this description here is very correct. And in the previous section that I had read, when he talked about the sort of circularity of thought and the lack of an external standard of determining what is true outside of a thought or outside of a belief, that seems like an odd statement and not really conforming with what I understand pragmatism to be. Of course, the mind is connected to external things. Of course, the mind has connections to the external world that influence and determine what is and isn't true. And what we determine to be true is severely influenced by things outside of our mind. That almost seems nonsensical to say otherwise. Anyway, let me jump into Charles Peirce's version here. He says, quote, Peirce had been touched by James's dedication of the will to believe to him, but he was not entirely pleased by the book. Will seemed to him exactly the wrong word to use about something, belief, which he thought meaningless if not instinctive. James came to regret the title too. He later said he wished he had used the phrase the right to believe, though that would scarcely have been more palatable to Peirce. But that is because individualism and voluntarism were values fundamental to James's thought, and they were values despised by Peirce. Peirce could not afford to buy Studies in Logical Theory when it came out in 1904, but he got a copy through the Nation. He was sympathetic to the spirit, but appalled by what he regarded as a lack of rigor. He wrote a letter to Dewey accusing him of intellectual licentiousness, but did not send it. He did, however, review the book anonymously in the Nation, where he was a little less damning, but only a little. "They make truth, which is a matter of fact, to be a matter of a way of thinking or even of linguistic expression," he complained. "The Chicago school or group are manifestly in radical opposition to the exact logicians, and are not making any studies which anybody in his senses can expect directly or indirectly in any considerable degree to influence 20th century science." Peirce's account of the way people think was the same as James's and Dewey's. He, too, regarded a belief as a kind of bet in a probabilistic universe, and successful bets, winning bets, as habits. And he, too, rejected the theory that the mind is the mirror of an external reality. There was no way to hook up ideas with things, Peirce thought, because ideas, mental representations, do not refer to things, they refer to other mental representations. When we hear the word tree, we do not perceive an actual tree, we perceive the conception of a tree that already exists in our minds. Peirce called this mediating representation an interpretant, a term he introduced in 1866 in a lecture in Boston attended by James and Oliver Wendell Holmes. "The meaning of a representation," he wrote in a later undated manuscript, "can be nothing but a representation. In fact, it is nothing but the representation itself conceived as stripped of irrelevant clothing. But this clothing can never be completely stripped off. It is only changed for something more diaphanous. So there is an infinite regression here. Finally, the interpretant is nothing but another representation, to which the torch of truth is handed along, and as a representation, it has its interpretant again. Lo, another infinite series." Peirce thought that our representations can be classified, filled out, and elaborated in all sorts of ways, that they can even become better, in the sense of more useful, as we peel off their metaphysical husks. But we can never, as individuals, say that they are identical with their objects. This is not just because our knowledge always swims, as Peirce put it, in a continuum of uncertainty and indeterminacy. It is also because, and this is the distinctive feature of Peirce's theory of signs, there are no pre-representational objects out there. Things are themselves signs. Their being signs is a condition of their being things at all. You can call this notion counterintuitive, because that is exactly what it is. It is part of Peirce's attack on the idea that we can know some things intuitively, that is, without the mediation of representations. For Peirce, knowing was inseparable from what he called semiosis, the making of signs, and of the making of signs there is no end. If you look up a word in the dictionary, you find it defined by a string of other words, the meanings of which can be discovered by looking them up in the dictionary, leading to more words to be looked up in turn. There is no exit from the dictionary. Peirce didn't simply think that language is like that, he thought that the universe is like that. So what did he mean when he accused the Chicago school of treating truth as a matter of linguistic expression rather than a matter of fact? He meant that Dewey had no teleology. The evolutionary concept of teleology is confusing. Darwin's theory is teleological in that it conceives of everything about an organism as designed for a purpose, ultimately the purpose of survival. That was one of the most revolutionary aspects of Darwin's thinking, and the source of James and Dewey's functionalism, their idea that beliefs are instruments for action. We don't act because we have ideas because we must act, and we act to achieve ends. But Darwin's theory is anti-teleological in that it does not conceive of the universe itself as designed for an end. Change is continual, but not directional. Evolutionary development is not guided by anything prior to or outside of itself. Peirce joined with James and Dewey on the first kind of teleology. He broke with them, and with Darwin, on the second. He did not think chance variation could explain evolution adequately. he thought God's love must play a more important role, a theory he called agapism, and derived in part from the Swedenborgian writings of Henry James Sr. And he could not imagine a universe devoid of ultimate meaning. He was quite explicit on this point. Physical evolution works toward ends in the same way that mental action works toward ends, he wrote in 1902 in an entry for a dictionary of philosophy and psychology edited by the functionalist James Mark Baldwin. Baldwin would one day come to share a distinction with Peirce. He was dismissed from the Hopkins faculty in 1909 after he was discovered by the Baltimore police during a raid on a black brothel. He ended his career in Mexico. For Peirce, habits are therefore not provisional adaptive responses to fluctuating environmental conditions. They are steps on the universal road from indeterminacy to law, a road traveled by objects as well as by organisms. For matter, Peirce thought, was simply mind whose habits have become so fixed as to lose the power of forming them and losing them. Habit, in Peirce's theory, is what makes all things, from molecules to philosophers, what they are. It is what enables them to persist in their condition of sameness, as we are, to other people, the set of repeated behaviors observable in us. If our behavior was perfectly arbitrary, that is, not habitual, we would have no identity. The price of having an identity is an inability fundamentally to transform it. Habit-taking is a plastic faculty in the sense that every organism has the potential to produce a variety of responses to a given stimulus. The peculiar characteristic of habit, as Peirce explained, is not acting with exactitude. But these responses cannot be random, since if they were, a law would not be possible. They cluster around a norm. This definition of a thing as the sum of its possible behaviors is what Peirce had meant by his principle of pragmatism. End quote. So a couple odd things in there. Just at the end there, Peirce definitely believes that there is a God influencing the universe, that evolution and all of reality is on a sort of course from an initial state of chaos to an ended state of order. And the formation of habits is the creation of order out of chaos. Like you have an identity, you have a personality. Your personality is comprised of your habits. If you acted totally randomly at any given moment, it'd be hard to say that you have a personality. There would be nothing to pin down. You don't behave randomly in every moment. You have certain tendencies. You react to certain things in certain ways. You laugh at certain jokes. You frown at certain things. You respond in certain ways to certain things. Those are your set of habits, and it's also your personality. Your personality is your habits. The price of having an identity is your inability to change your identity and to change your habits. And he talks about Darwin a little bit and basically says that Darwin has a sort of teleology or a purpose to its process insofar as the things that we do and the habits that we have as living organisms and the structures of our physical forms are moving toward an end of fitting with the environment in such a way as to maximize our survival and replication, right? Our habit of form, like you're not going to give birth to a cat, right? You're going to give birth to a human, and there may be mutations of one sort or another, but the mutations are somewhat constrained to within the human species, and you could consider that a sort of habit. There was no human species until, and then the human species developed as a habit of genetic activity. Our genetic structure formed. I guess my point here is that you could see, like, let's say the solar system starts as a cloud of matter, and parts of it coalesce into a sun, and parts of it coalesce into planets, and it goes from being this formless, churning chaos of matter, and it develops habits of behavior. There becomes one star in the middle. Sometimes there becomes two stars, but in our solar system, there becomes one star in the middle. There becomes planets. They form out of the matter, and it it becomes very fixed and rigid, right? It's very predictable what planet is going to be where at what time. It goes from a chaos to an order as the habits of behavior of the molecules that comprise the solar system become locked into particular patterns of behavior. Those patterns of behavior, of course, dictated by the structure of the material. You know, the mass of the planets, the mass of the sun, determine the activity of the solar system. So the habits are defined by the matter, and in the same way, your habits of a human person are defined by the matter in the brain, the neurological connections, the mental pathways, how one word always pops to mind in a certain circumstance, or even a song that gets stuck in your head, or when something happens, you respond in a certain way. That's all built up neural pathways. That's all material of, you know, the cells in your brain connecting in certain patterns, and not connecting in other patterns, so that the electrical currents in your brain follow a similar circuit repeatedly. He says, for Peirce, habits are therefore not provisional adaptive responses to fluctuating environmental conditions. They're steps on the universal road from indeterminacy to law, a road traveled by objects as well as by organisms. Now, again, here we start to see the opposite perspective, where he talks about the dictionary, and like any entry in the dictionary, any word in the dictionary gets its definition from a sequence of other words, all in the dictionary. You can look up each of those words. Each definition is another sequence of words that can all be looked up, and there's no exit from the dictionary. There's no point in the dictionary where you go to read something and it says, put the dictionary down, you know, and do this or do that. And even then, you're just looking at a sequence of words. The premise here that words are all sort of self-contained and there's no connection, there's no real explicit connection to the external world. And I think that intuitively we hear that and we think, yeah, but that's kind of nonsense. I think that we wouldn't be able to make our way in the world if all of the contents of our brain were like a dictionary that didn't refer to anything else but the other contents of the brain, right? I mean, obviously, intuitively, we think that doesn't make sense. Charles Peirce is no fool, so how is it that he can make that sort of an argument? And then the author says here, Peirce didn't simply think that language is like that. He thought that the universe is like that, so that things are themselves signs. There being signs is a condition of there being things at all. And I guess the only way that I could really understand that is, let's say, you know, a tree. We look at a tree and we call it a tree, but it could also be said to be a collection of atoms, and a collection of atoms that are structured into certain molecules, and they're all stacked up and attached to one another in various means. And this particular pattern of molecules, we look at it and we call it a tree, right? We give it a name. We see it as a thing that is similar in some way to some other tree. It shares some sort of characteristics of this other tree, but they're all just sets of atoms. But I just find it kind of difficult to really grab hold of the idea that things are symbols, and that there's nothing that's not a symbol at the base of it. To me, that would sort of extend the definition of the word symbol to cover everything, right? If everything is a symbol, then what even does the word symbol mean? What is excluded from? What is not a symbol? What is outside of the symbols? Nothing. If nothing is really outside of the set of things that are symbols, that are representations of some other thing, doesn't the word symbol sort of lose any meaning? Doesn't a symbol as a representation of another thing at some point sort of depend on something somewhere being a real thing that is not a symbol of something else. Now, it might be that you can break down atoms into constituent parts, and you might say, what's an atom but a merely a pattern of behavior of other subatomic particles? But, that's not necessarily the same thing. One thing referring to another thing as a symbol, that the word tree is a symbol for the thing that is the tree. But then the tree is not necessarily a symbol of the atoms. That's a different definition of the word symbol. And maybe I haven't really read Peirce's writings on symbols enough to be able to speak to it. But there's certain parts of his thought, just as much as there are certain parts of James's thought, and there are certain parts of Dewey's thought that I think don't make a lot of sense. And so, I think perhaps at some point as I continue exploring pragmatism, I may get to some later writers. Certainly Peirce, James, and Dewey are not the only pragmatists. And I hope that I can come across some later thinkers who refine pragmatism and kind of brush off some of the more exotic and not really sustainable ideas. These guys were sort of pioneers in thought, and they had some great ideas, but as is often the case as pioneers, they also went off in a few strange and incorrect directions. So, but that's going to come with further examination of other pragmatists writing in later decades. And it may be the case that they all have something about their writings that doesn't quite fit, and maybe I'll have to write the book that puts it all together one of these days. We'll see. But moving on from there, he does talk a little bit about how their ideas don't really align with one another. I mean, you saw there how Peirce was quite critical of Dewey's book, Studies in Logical Theory. These guys don't agree about everything. So it's not possible to say pragmatism is what Peirce believed or pragmatism is what Dewey believed, because they're all pragmatists, and at the same time, they all disagree pretty fundamentally about some important things. So I think pragmatism's definitions are a little porous. So here he says, quote, "As James saw right away, he and Dewey came to pragmatism from nearly opposite philosophical directions. James took his inspiration from, besides Charles Renouvier, a philosopher Dewey does not seem to have taken an interest in, the British empiricists, John Locke, David Hume, and George Berkeley. Writers James thought had reduced philosophical terms like matter and identity to their cash value. James dedicated pragmatism to John Stuart Mill, whom my fancy likes to picture as our leader were he here today. Mill and the British empiricists were, of course, the bane of the tradition in which Dewey had been trained, just as Hegel, whose work Dewey said left a permanent deposit in my thinking, was the particular bête noire of William James. James and Dewey were both affected by the new psychology, it's true, but James was contemptuous of most of the prevailing assumptions in that field, even when he was composing his landmark summation of its findings, and the compliment was returned. James's influence, both in philosophy and psychology, appears to me to be getting positively unwholesome, the Wundtian Edward Titchener complained to McKean Cattle a few months after James introduced pragmatism in the Berkeley lecture. His credulity and his appeals to emotion are surely the reverse of scientific. Pragmatism was, in many respects, a reaction against experimental psychology. It rejected not only the static, structural model of Wundtian psychology, the model Dewey demolished in the reflex arc paper, but the behaviorism implicit in early 20th century version of the functionalist model as well. The bigger intellectual picture is similarly equivocal. Pragmatism seems a reflection of the late 19th century faith in scientific inquiry, yet James introduced it in order to attack the pretensions of late 19th century science. Pragmatism seems Darwinian, yet it was openly hostile to the two most prominent Darwinists of the time, Herbert Spencer and Thomas Huxley. It was designed, in James's version, to get God back into a picture many people felt Darwin had written him out of. And it had nothing in common with the thoughts of people like William Graham Sumner or with the eugenics movement, which was based on the work of Darwin's cousin, the statistician Francis Galton. Pragmatism seems to derive from statistical thinking. But many 19th century statisticians were committed to principles of laissez-faire James and Dewey did not endorse. And many turn-of-the-century statisticians, Galton was one of the most renowned, were committed to ideas of race building and social engineering that are alien to everything James and Dewey wrote. Pragmatism shares Emerson's distrust of institutions and systems, and his manner of appropriating ideas while discarding their philosophical foundations, but it does not share his conception of the individual conscience as a transcendental authority. In short, pragmatism was a variant of many strands in 19th century thought, but by no means their destined point of convergence. It fit in with the stock of existing ideas in ways that made it seem recognizable and plausible. James subtitled Pragmatism a new name for old ways of thinking. But pragmatism was the product of a group of individuals, and it took its shape from the way they bounced off one another, their circumstances, and the mysteries of their unreproducible personalities. A pragmatic account of pragmatism's emergence would, in any case, look not to its origins, but to its consequences. What changes in American life made pragmatism seem to some people the right philosophical utensil for a few decades after 1898? Though the immediate outcome of the Pullman boycott was disastrous for labor, Dewey and Jane Addams had been right when they predicted that the episode would eventually be seen to mark the obsolescence of 19th century economic arrangements. The year James introduced pragmatism was also the year the American economy began to move away from an individualistic ideal of unrestrained competition and toward a bureaucratic ideal of management and regulation. Starting with the Erdman Act, passed by Congress in 1898, which recognized the rights of workers to organize and provide for the mediation of labor disputes by a government board, the state began assuming a role in economic affairs, and as epitomized by the creation of United States Steel in 1901, which merged 158 companies into one organization, American business began exchanging an entrepreneurial model in which an individual like George Pullman could run his company largely according to his own wishes and straight into the ground if he liked, for a corporate model in which a board of directors, dominated usually by bankers, oversaw company policy in the interest of investors, the system of finance capitalism. The period of pragmatism's efflorescence, from 1898 to 1917, was a period when the values of corporate management, public oversight, and political reform were in ascendance. The intellectual elite was finished with the Gilded Age, and so, for its own reasons, was the business elite. Pragmatism's appeal in these circumstances is not hard to understand. Everything James and Dewey wrote as pragmatists boiled down to a single claim. People are the agents of their own destinies. They dispelled the fatalism that haunts almost every 19th century system of thought, the mechanical or materialist determinism of writers like Laplace, Malthus, Darwin, Spencer, Huxley, and Marx, and the providential or absolutist determinism of writers like Hegel, Agassiz, Morris, and the Peirces. James and Dewey described a universe still in progress, a place where no conclusion is foregone and every problem is amenable to the exercise of what Dewey calls intelligent action. They spoke to a generation of academics, journalists, jurists, and policymakers eager to find scientific solutions to social problems, and happy to be given good reasons to ignore the claims of finished cosmologies. End quote. All right, so we've got a couple things going on here. Firstly, he points out that James and Dewey came at psychology and philosophy from different directions. William James coming from the direction of the British empiricists like John Stuart Mill, and Dewey coming from the position of Hegel. He was a Hegelian. He grew out of Hegelianism, but he said it always left a sort of permanent mark on his writings. So they kind of came at it from different directions. So Dewey had written a psychology textbook early in his career. James read it and didn't really like it. It was Hegelian, and James was skeptical about it. I haven't read this. It's not generally considered a major part of John Dewey's writings. Over time, they kind of grew closer together, and they became good friends, and they became, very much on the same page about a lot of things. But as is obvious from various, aspects of what I've read here, it wasn't exactly a single line of thought that determined the pragmatic approach. There were different takes on it. And Peirce didn't really appreciate the way that James was taking it, the direction that James was taking it. He was skeptical about some of the things that James was doing with it. He actually tried to rename his own philosophy Pragmatism. He said that was ugly enough that no one would kidnap it, kind of a dig at James, I think, taking the name Pragmatism off in other directions that he hadn't really intended. So these guys clashed a little bit, but on the whole, they got along with one another more or less. But yeah, it seems as though Peirce was very skeptical of the direction that Dewey was taking it. So there's some clashes, but they also, there was some friendliness as well. But what it is interesting where he does kind of say that there's a lot of things that seem like pragmatism would be friendly to, like Darwinism, and yet it's also openly hostile to prominent Darwinists. And as you've seen in some of the other books I've read, William James was very skeptical about some of the claims of various Darwinists, despite the fact that he was more or less considered himself a Darwinist. But he felt that other people, again, had sort of taken Darwinism into the wrong direction. So that it touches on, like, Emerson, but then it disputes Emerson. It touches on a bunch of different things and also sort of disputes it. So it's kind of carving out its own space, but what that space is not extremely locked down. But then he talks about, so what were the circumstances that made pragmatism so appealing? And he says that one thing, and this is also strange, a little bit strange. Basically, so just jumping from the very end here, he says they spoke to a generation of academics, journalists, jurists, and policymakers eager to find scientific solutions to social problems, happy to be given good reason to ignore the claims of finished cosmologies. So there's a bunch of theories about the way things work, and nobody really wanted to just accept the way things had been done in the past. Lots of stuff is changing. The way societies are organized is changing. There had been a real strong belief in laissez-faire economics, and this is changing as it's becoming more. There's more regulation. There's less small business entrepreneurship. There's more large corporations, and people just want to build systems that work. They don't want to be stuck to some prior system of the way things should be, or like finished systems of, well, everything works just so, like laissez-faire capitalism, proposing that, if you just take a total hands-off approach, everything will come out just the way it should. Don't do anything. Don't affect anything. And people wanted to push back on this, and they didn't necessarily have all of the theories necessary as built up and as solidified of an alternative theory. They wanted to kind of create new theories. They wanted to come up with a new way of doing things. And they didn't want to be bound by any sort of pre-existing philosophy, whether it's laissez-faire or Marxism or anything else. They just wanted to do things that worked and not be bound by ideologies. That was sort of the prevailing feeling among reformers and among thinkers at the time. They didn't want to be locked down into how they addressed social problems. And so in that regard, pragmatism just really fit the bill. Because pragmatism can be a little loose, right? Oh, well, we've determined that this is the right thing to do, that this will work, and so we're going to do it. It just total freedom to do whatever you think is the best thing to do and say, well, we're going to be pragmatists about it and we're going to do what works, despite oftentimes doing things that hadn't been proven to work. There's a sort of, when things are established, it's because they have proven themselves to work. And when you're starting things fresh and you're trying new things, it's hard to make arguments that this is going to work or that's going to work or the other thing works. the thing that works is the thing that has proven itself in reality to have worked in the past. So there's a sort of pragmatic value in recognizing the importance of established institutions who have already proven themselves to work over the course of time. But that was not really the prevailing theory at the time. Anyway, now that we've established that pragmatism means many things to many people and can be used for many different purposes and sometimes conflicting, let's move forward to I want to talk about a few different phenomena that sprang out of pragmatism, particularly that sprang out of John Dewey's actions. John Dewey, I think, as I said in the section that I read there about John Dewey's vision of pragmatism, I think that John Dewey really gets a lot of things right in his understanding of pragmatism. But then when he tries to deploy it in the social sphere, when he tries to bring pragmatism to the actual situation of mankind, he all of a sudden seems to veer off very rapidly into idealism and notions about the way the world works that don't really add up. So, while I like his version of raw pragmatism, I don't always like his version of applied pragmatism. One thing I want to talk about is a fellow by the name of Randolph Bourne, who was a writer. He passed away at a young age. He got influenza during the influenza epidemic of 1918. He was a student of John Dewey's, and he had at one point been a friend of John Dewey's. He was younger, significantly younger than John Dewey, but he was a student of his, and he ultimately turned against John Dewey, and their relationship broke off, and they were no longer friendly with one another over their differences that they had. And Randolph Bourne, I think, is just a real negative influence on America. He's not hugely influential, but he was writing ideas. He had an essay, very famous essay called Transnational America, and he was extremely progressive, kind of anarchistic progressive, I think, in a way. And he was really opposed to the American culture. He almost seemed like he was opposed to almost everything. And he just wanted to break things, but in his own way. He wasn't outwardly an anarchist, but he was a cosmopolitan in such a way that any adherence to like nationalism was the great enemy. Any adherence to culture was the great enemy. Everything sort of needed to get dissolved. But I've read a little bit of his essay. I haven't read the essay in its entirety, but I've read a little bit of it. I read a little bit about him, and they write about him here, and it just seems incoherent to me. Maybe you think it's more coherent, but I really don't. He says, quote, Dewey was an Americanist and a modernist by desire. To Dewey, Americanism meant democracy, and modernity meant a life in which possibilities are unforeclosed. It is therefore appropriate that the most militantly modernist version of pluralism should have come from one of Dewey's own renegade disciples. This was Randolph Bourne. Bourne was from New Jersey. His family was Presbyterian, and not undistinguished. His great-grandfather had been an abolitionist and an acquaintance of Emerson's. But business failures had reduced its circumstances, and though Bourne was a precocious student, he could not afford to attend college until he was 23, when, in 1909, he entered Columbia on a full academic scholarship. Bourne was, he wrote an essay about it, severely disabled. A forceps delivery had badly mangled his features at birth, and when he was 4, he had come down with tuberculosis of the spine, the disease that had stricken Jane Addams. In Bourne's case, the effects were more serious. His growth was stunted, and he developed a hunchback. He was always self-conscious about his condition. He thought his appearance made people underestimate his capacities, and he compensated for it with a brilliance that could be exceptionally caustic. My fate, he wrote to a friend while he was still in college, seems to lie in poking holes in what other people are saying. Bourne was introduced to the writings of William James in a philosophy class taught by Frederick Woodbridge. He was, as he put it, hypnotized. James's books, he explained to a friend in 1913, are the most inspiring modern outlook on life and reality. He became a student of Dewey's and contracted what he called the virus of the Bergson-James Schiller instrumental pragmatism. He was also an admirer of Boas's The Mind of Primitive Man, which he reviewed in the Columbia Monthly. He knew the work in social psychology of J. McKean Cattell and E. L. Thorndike, and he developed a socialist politics, in part through his classes with the historian Charles Beard. The effect of all this education, enhanced by a year spent traveling through Europe after graduation, was distinctive. It turned Bourne into a new sort of American radical, a cultural radical. He believed that American society must be transformed, and that the site of that transformation must be the culture, and he thought pragmatism supplied the method. Dewey's philosophy of instrumentalism, he wrote in the New Republic in 1915, has an edge on it that would slash up the habits of thought, the customs and institutions in which our society has been living for centuries. It is not a claim Dewey or James would ever have made, but it was how Bourne interpreted their legacy. He had contempt for what he called the blind recalcitrancy of progressives and feminists of the Jane Addams type. He was not a reformer, he wanted a movement. He thought he found one in the ethnic transformation of American society by immigration. Bourne knew Callan personally and found his Nation essay extremely stimulating. He had already discussed the issue of assimilation with his Columbia friends, and one of them, probably Alexander Sachs, a graduate student of Dewey's who became an economic advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, suggested transnationalism as a description of a pluralist America. Bourne adopted the term for a title of what would become his best-known essay, Transnational America. It was published in the Atlantic Monthly in July 1916. Bourne's essay is a kind of synthesis of pluralist ideas. Bourne evoked Boas's conception of racial plasticity. Let us speak not of inferior races, but of inferior civilizations. It is not what we are now that concerns us, but what this plastic next generation may become in the light of a new cosmopolitan ideal. He repeated Dewey's critique of liberal individualism. If freedom means the right to do pretty much as one pleases, the immigrant has found freedom, and the ruling element has been singularly liberal in its treatment of the invading hordes. But if freedom means democratic cooperation in determining the ideals and purposes and industrial and social institutions of a country, then the immigrant has not been free, and the Anglo-Saxon element is guilty of just what every dominant race is guilty of in every European country, the imposition of its own culture upon the minority peoples. He echoed Callan's warning about the effects of mass culture. Already we have far too much of this insipidity, masses of people who are cultural half-breeds, neither assimilated Anglo-Saxons nor nationals of another culture. Letting slip whatever native culture they had, they have substituted for it only the most rudimentary American, the American culture of the cheap newspaper, the movies, popular song, the ubiquitous automobile. He adopted James's figure of the Federation. There is no distinctively American culture. It is apparently our lot rather to be a federation of cultures. He embraced the concept of dual identity. Dual citizenship seems to us profound and right, for it recognizes that although the Frenchman may accept the formal institutional framework of his new country, and indeed become intensely loyal to it, yet his Frenchness he will never lose. More importantly, though, and like Locke but in a different spirit, he praised cultural identity in order to transcend it. Bourne's ideal was not Americanism. It was an international cosmopolitanism, which America might lead by example. He aspired not to preserve cultural traditions, but to create new cultural possibilities. He was a true modernist. His fear, therefore, was that official recognition of the integrity and autonomy of ethnic subcultures would lead to the persistence in the United States of customs and folkways that were already disappearing in Europe. The last thing he wanted was to preserve the pre-modern culture of the peasant village or the shtetl. His image of cosmopolitanism was an enlightened ethnicity, a kind of post-ethnic ethnic identification. Specifically, it was Zionism, which he apparently imagined as an abstract commitment rather than an actual resettlement. He made the point explicit 3 months after Transnational America appeared in an address to the Harvard Menorah Society, the group Callan had helped to found. Transnationalism, Bourne told the members, is a Jewish idea. The accommodation that diaspora Jews had had to make to the dominant culture was the model for the accommodation every ethnic group must make. Zionism was the ideal because a genuine transnationalism would be modern, and the Zionist outlook is intensely modern. The Jew in America is proving every day the possibility of this dual life. End quote. So I think that what we get is something that's just a little incoherent. So he says that he's against the sort of assimilation, right? He is opposed to assimilation in this essay. Like, for example, he says that he embraced the concept of dual identity. He says, dual citizenship seems to us profound and right, for it recognizes that although the Frenchman may accept the formal institutional framework of his new country and indeed become intensely loyal to it, his Frenchness he will never lose. So people always maintain a sort of some bit of wherever they were originally from. Everyone who comes to America is going to carry with them some component of their homeland. Like, okay, that makes sense. That doesn't seem too far-fetched, and I'm sure when people come to this country, they adapt to the American way of life, and yet they also preserve some component of the old ways of their homeland, right? So he never loses his Frenchness. There's something in him that's always French. So he'll always be sort of a French American, not just an American, but a French American. So he'll carry that with him. But in the same time, he also says that his fear is the official recognition of the integrity of ethnic subcultures will lead to the persistence in the United States of customs and folkways that were already disappearing in Europe. The last thing he wanted to preserve was to preserve the pre-modern culture of the peasant village. So he doesn't really want to see the old ways continued. He doesn't want to see the old cultures of the old world carry on in the United States, but he also doesn't want to see them completely give up and adopt this sort of Americanism. He seems to me like there's a statement early in this section where he says to his classmate at school that he says, "My fate seems to lie in poking holes in what other people are saying." I think he ultimately was more into destruction than building anything. He viewed the Anglo-Saxons as being guilty of imposing their culture on the people who showed up. He thought that there was something wrong with expecting people who showed up to adopt this Anglo-Saxon culture that was so predominant. And he says that the Anglo-Saxon is guilty of just what every dominant race is guilty of in every European country, the imposition of its own culture upon the minority peoples. And this seems ridiculous to me. First of all, if you're talking about European countries, the dominant peoples of any European country are the native people of that land, or as close to native, let's say, as one is going to get in the modern world. And why shouldn't the majority of these countries impose its culture on the minorities? He's really the first advocate of some sort of salad bowl culture rather than melting pot culture. He doesn't want to see the assimilation. He wants the minority cultures to be able to preserve their independence from the overbearing Anglo-Saxons or the overbearing Europeans. But he himself is of Anglo-Saxon descent, I might add. But he doesn't want them to preserve their old ways. He doesn't want them to be separate, but he doesn't want them also to be assimilated. He wants them to sort of stand halfway between. And he kind of is against everything with the exception of cosmopolitanism. He's for it seems as though he wants every nation in the world to just be a complete cosmopolitan mishmash of all of the peoples of the world, and that the United States should lead the way in building this sort of transnational America. Like one foot in the old world, and he talks about Jews and Zionism and the diaspora and the way that they've sort of maintained their own aspects of their own culture. At the same time, they've also had to adopt the cultures of their adopted lands. And so the Jews are like half Jewish and also half American. They're a little bit of both. The French are partly French and partly American. But the American, it seems like what he wants them to be is not to adopt like American norms of any sort of culture, any sort of American culture, but he just seems like everybody should have one foot in their old ways, but only slightly, and then the other foot maybe just in a mishmash of cosmopolitan everything, everywhere, all at once. It just seems destructive. It seems like he's more interested in destroying dominant cultures. He wants nowhere to ever have a dominant culture. All dominant cultures must be subdued, and everything is cosmopolitan. I just find it really destructive. And ultimately, John Dewey, he says that we don't really know too much about what John Dewey thought about his pluralistic, his version of pluralism, because they separated on different grounds. They ultimately disagreed about entrance into World War I. Bourne said we should not enter World War I, we should stay out of it, and John Dewey wanted to enter World War I. And on this issue, I think actually Bourne had the right idea. John Dewey, after World War I, changed his tune a little bit and became more of a pacifist. So on that issue, I think Bourne was probably correct. John Dewey wanted to, make the world safe for democracy, as John Dewey's proclivity for, swallowing progressive propaganda. But John Dewey was not so as extreme as Bourne was. John Dewey was an Americanist. He says he was an Americanist and a modernist by choice. Bourne was not an Americanist in the sense that he thought that America should have a culture, but that the American culture should be the culture of no culture. Right? The American culture should be the culture of everybody else's cultures combined. The cosmopolitanism should be the American culture. The transnationalism should be the American culture. Nothing uniquely distinct about it that is, separate from anything distinct about any other country. So I don't think that John Dewey was on the same page, but still he sort of, Bourne took the pragmatism and ran with it. And some of, whether John Dewey has any responsibility for the things that Bourne went with, I don't know. I used to, so when I first read this, I thought this was really an outgrowth of John Dewey's ideas where Bourne decided to take it. I begin to think that's less the case. But the point being that, pragmatism has this gaping hole of not really saying what we should be doing. Just that our philosophy should be, and I talked about this when I reviewed John Dewey's book, Reconstruction in Philosophy. How pragmatism doesn't really say what it is that we should be doing, just that philosophy should be helping us solve our problems. Philosophy should not have its head in the clouds, but it should be here solving human problems. But then what are human problems? What makes them problems? What makes us think they're solvable? What makes us want to solve them? What are things going to look like if we solve them? Those questions are not really answered by pragmatism. And you can sort of plug in whatever you want. Like the human problem is that we're not dedicated enough to science. The human problem is that we're not dedicated enough to democracy. The human problem is that some people in the world are hungry, or some people suffer. None of those statements about what the human problem is are supported or refuted by pragmatism. Pragmatism just doesn't really say an awful lot about that. And that's really where I think that's where the pragmatists go down all these crazy roads because they haven't really pinned down what we're supposed to be doing, why we're forming nations, why we're engaging in anything, why we're doing things. The rejection of some aspects of Darwinism, I think, leave them a bit exposed. They should, I think, be more embracing of some of the social Darwinist ideas of the era, and maybe those social Darwinist ideas needed refinement. Maybe they were tossed aside in a very early state, and they hadn't really been formed into correct, accurate, useful versions of social Darwinism. They were aborted, or they were smothered in the cradle before they could really mature. But that probably would have been a good avenue for the early pragmatists to pin down what we should be doing and why we organize ourselves into societies and why we strive to do one thing versus another thing. Absent that, anybody can grab hold of it and take it wherever they want. Ultimately, he turned against pragmatism, but I think that he only turned against pragmatism because he turned against John Dewey. And actually, Bourne does criticize pragmatism just along those lines. He says at a later section just afterwards, 1917, in the Seven Arts, Bourne published an essay called Twilight of the Idols, in which he denounced pragmatism, and Dewey and instrumentalism in particular, for being against concern for the quality of life above machinery of life. So Bourne believes that the quality of life is more important than the mechanisms by which society is structured, and pragmatism doesn't do that. He says pragmatism provided no stable criteria for how values are to be judged. Bourne now complained. Dewey always meant his philosophy, when taken as a philosophy of life, to start with values, but there was always that unhappy ambiguity in his doctrine as to just how values were created, and it became easier and easier to assume that just any growth was justified and almost any activity valuable so long as it achieved ends. So, as long as you're doing something and something happens as a result, then we can all say, oh, hooray, something was accomplished. But there's nothing in John Dewey specifying how values are created, what those values ought to be. Now, John Dewey does have values of his own that he advances, particularly more so later on in his life after that essay was written. But the criticism stands that anyone can take pragmatism down any direction they want because there's not enough of a clear statement about what the ends ought to be. And it's really a gaping hole and never adequately filled. So anyway, moving on to one more section here where there's another, and this is something that Dewey had more involvement in. He wasn't really involved in the things that Randolph Bourne was doing, but it was worth mentioning because he did kind of spin off from Dewey's classroom into his own progressive insanity. But here we get something that Dewey was more actively involved in, and that is the American Association of University Professors. So here he says, quote, "The desire to protect academic freedom was not, as it happened, the chief motivation for the formation of the AAUP. Its principal organizers were John Dewey and the Hopkins philosopher Arthur O. Lovejoy. Lovejoy was no friend of pragmatism. He had received an M.A. from Harvard in 1897, but he was a philosophical realist and the author of an article, The 13 Pragmatisms, published in the Journal of Philosophy in 1908, frequently cited by critics of James and Dewey. But Lovejoy had been one of the 7 professors who had resigned from Stanford in the wake of Ross's dismissal. He had taught at Columbia for a year before going to Hopkins, and he respected Dewey. Along with a number of other prominent academics, including J. McKean Cattle, the psychologist who had helped bring Dewey and Franz Boas to Columbia, they met in Baltimore in 1913 and began planning their organization. What Dewey envisioned, as he put it in a letter to Boas soliciting his participation, was an association representing the interests of American university teachers, comparable to the American bar or medical associations. He did not imagine a trade union. When Dewey invited Barrett Wendell to join, Wendell wrote back to say he didn't much like the idea of a professional guild. Dewey replied that he didn't either. It was not at all what he had in mind. If I thought an organization could or would lessen the freedom of individual scholars, he told Wendell, I should be heartily opposed to it. And if I thought there was any danger of an organization attempting to run institutions instead of allowing the constituted authorities to run them, I should be at least suspicious of the organization. As Dewey saw it, the role of the AAUP was to make the case for scholarship to the American public. One of the chief questions he and the other founders debated had to do with the criteria for admission. It was felt that the membership should be restricted to prominent scholars, since they would represent the profession at its finest, and for a few years it was. In 1915, the AAUP came into formal existence, and Dewey was made its first president. In his address at the first meeting, he dismissed the notion that the organization would be required to devote much of its time to investigating violations of academic freedom. At the end of the year, he was obliged to report that he had been too optimistic. 31 academic freedom cases came before the AAUP in its first 2 years, and they didn't stop coming. It seemed that the right of university teachers to express their views was not as secure as Dewey had imagined. In the end, most membership restrictions were lifted, and the AAUP became just what Dewey had hoped it would not have to become, a union for professors and the national academic freedom watchdog. The creation of the AAUP was the capstone event in the process of the professionalization of the university that got underway after the Civil War, and in which Charles William Eliot, Daniel Coit Gilman, and William Rainey Harper played leading roles. And as it turned out, the concept of academic freedom was the key to the whole development. For professions, unlike other types of occupations, are self-regulating. No professional, no doctor or lawyer or architect wants to have the terms of his or her practice dictated by someone other than his or her peers, people who have the interests of the profession rather than the interests of some other group outside the profession at heart. Doctors don't want insurance companies to determine what constitutes good medical practice. Architects don't want developers to determine who is qualified to practice architecture. Lawyers don't want politicians to define legal ethics. This is one of the reasons education in those fields is confined almost exclusively to professional schools, who get to pick the students they want to initiate. American universities became modern when they finally arrived, around the time the AAUP came into existence, at an institutional structure designed to make academic work self-regulating. This meant making the PhD the normal requirement for employment at a university, since people with PhDs have been credentialed by established experts in their fields. It meant requiring publication in peer-reviewed journals for professional advancement, since, again, peer review is a way of maintaining professorial control over the kind of scholarship that gets produced and rewarded. It meant establishing the department as the basic administrative unit of the university, since departments hire, promote, tenure, and fire their own members and set their own curricula. All these mechanisms are ways of ensuring that only specialists get to judge the work of other specialists, and of insulating the content of academic work from the political, financial, and personal interests of administrators, trustees, legislators, alumni, and amateurs. Academic freedom is a freedom specifically for academics, and it can be enjoyed only by people already admitted to the club. Professions are democratic in the sense that they are open to anyone with talent, but they are guilds in the sense that they protect their members from market forces, with which all non-professionals have to cope. The tenured professor not only has access to resources, libraries, students, scholarly networks, almost entirely off limits to the independent scholar. He or she has a lifetime guaranteed income as well. Professionalization is a system of market control. Academic freedom for a professor is, therefore, actually or potentially a restriction on everyone who is not a professor. But what is the social good? Why should society prefer that Edward Ross, an employee of a private institution, be permitted to say whatever he chooses but the Jane Stanford who pays his salary should be prevented from trying to shape the intellectual content of her own university. She, with her husband, had created Stanford. She was free to close it down whenever she liked, but she could not fire Edward Ross. The AAUP's answer to this question appeared in a document called The Report on Academic Freedom and Tenure, drawn up by Committee A of the Association, the committee charged with investigating violations of academic freedom, and printed in the first volume of the Association's bulletin in December 1915. The reason administrators and trustees should have no power to sanction professors for their views, the statement said, was because professors did not work for the trustees. They worked for the public. The responsibility of the university teacher is primarily to the public itself, and to the judgment of his own profession. And while, with respect to certain external conditions of his vocation, he accepts a responsibility to the authorities of the institution in which he serves, in the essentials of his professional activity, his duty is to the wider public, to which the institution itself is morally amenable. University teachers should be understood to be, with respect to the conclusions reached and expressed by them, no more subject to the control of the trustees than judges subject to the control of the president with respect to their decisions. Whether Dewey wrote these sentences is not known, but they plainly express his own rationale for academic freedom. During Dewey's year as president of the AAUP, the trustees of the University of Pennsylvania refused to renew the contract of the economist Scott Nearing, who was on the faculty of the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, because of his reformist views. Despite its name, the University of Pennsylvania was essentially a private institution, but it received some state support, and it was the threat of reduced state funding that provoked the trustees to dismiss Nearing. The incident got a lot of attention, and the New York Times published an editorial under the headline, "The Philadelphia Martyr," maintaining that the trustees had the right to dismiss anyone they saw fit, and no obligation to provide their reasons for doing so. Dewey's letter to the editor in reply was unusually pointed. It is doubtless fitting and natural that the New York Times should find university professors chartered libertines of speech given in to too much foolish babbling whenever the results of the investigations of university scholars lead them to question any features of the existing economic order, he began. The Times was perfectly entitled, in other words, to express opinions flattering to its constituency, but it misunderstood the nature of academic work. You apparently take the ground that a modern university is a personally conducted institution like a factory, Dewey explained, and that if for any reason the utterances of any teacher, within or without the university walls, are objectionable to the trustees, there is nothing more to be said. This view virtually makes the trustees owners of a private undertaking, but the modern university is in every respect, save its legal management, a public institution with public responsibilities. Professors have been trained to think of the pursuit and expression of truth as a public function to be exercised on behalf of the interests of their moral employer, society as a whole. They ask for no social immunities or privileges for themselves. They will be content for their own protection with any system which protects the relation of the modern university to the public as a whole. The Dartmouth College case is often cited as the foundation for academic freedom in the United States, but the argument the Supreme Court rejected in that case in 1819 is precisely the argument Dewey and the AAUP advanced almost a century later as academic freedom's rationale. The court took Dartmouth College away from a state legislature and returned it to its owners on the grounds that it was a private corporation immune from public control. In rescuing private colleges from the politicians, the court effectively turned them over to the trustees. It did not turn them over to the professors. What Dewey and the AAUP accomplished was therefore a rather remarkable end run around Dartmouth College. They created a non-governmental organization, the AAUP, that claimed to represent the public interest against the university's own benefactors, and they defined that interest as a need for disinterested scholarship. The deal they offered was that in return for exemption from ordinary market conditions, professors would commit themselves to the unselfish and disinterested pursuit of truth. Implicit in the argument they made was that the public, though supposedly the real owners of universities, would abstain from interference in university affairs out of its own self-interest. Edward Ross's freedom from Jane Stanford would have been worth nothing, after all, if the voters of California could have fired him instead. And the most remarkable thing about this deal was that American society, with, to be sure, many reservations and regrets along the way, bought it. End quote. So, what do we have here? The AAUP, the Association of University Professors, which is essentially a sort of professional organization of university professors that was established, in Dewey's words, to make the case for scholarship to the American public, but ultimately wound up serving a different role than what Dewey had intended. It became more of a guild or a union that any restrictions to entry, originally they had wanted only the finest scholars, but those restrictions to entry were all lifted, and all the university professors were able to join, and the actions of this organization really turned toward protecting the academic freedom of the professors, protecting the professors' ability to say what they wanted. And this was on the heels of a case where a professor named Ross was fired by Stanford University, by Jane Stanford, who owned it. And this, I think, is an oddly contrast to Randolph Bourne, who was the total radical. This is the establishment of bureaucracy. And this organization advocates for the interests of the university professors, and basically says that the professors don't have to do what the trustees or the administrators tell them to do. They're not subject to the whim. So if the president of a university says everybody has to teach this particular doctrine, if you don't teach that doctrine, then you'll get fired. If you do things that question the state, then the state can pressure the university, and then the university, in order to maintain its funding from the state, will fire you. If the state threatens to pull funding against people who advocate against it, the professors are all constrained, and they have to sort of follow the line, and so this organization was really to advance academic freedom. And I think that there's something valuable in that, right? I mean, a professor's job is to try to uncover the truth and try to share the truth with other people. If a professor is just regurgitating something that they don't believe in, but they're forced to say, they're not really professors, they're not teachers, they're not tellers of truth, they're propagandists. So having some sort of freedom for professors to be able to speak their minds about things, that's, on its face, that seems pretty important. And that's clearly an issue that we deal with in today's world. We see a lot today of universities and the administrators of universities, the management of universities, cracking down on university professors being able to say what they want. But there's certainly negative effects, and the problem that we find is that we tend to think, or some people tend to think, that some certain category of people are immune to the corrupting influences that everyone else in the world is susceptible to. So the idea that like leftist ideology can't take over the university through the avenue of the professor, that oppressive regimes can only come in through the administrators. The administrators are going to crack down. The state's going to crack down. But the professors are these noble speakers of truth, and so they need to regulate themselves because nobody else can be trusted outside of their little bubble, right? But the ideology can get into the professors, and the organizations that are managed, the departments that are run by professors can themselves become oppressive, corrupting institutions and influences, so that it becomes a case where the professor is not oppressed by the trustees, but they're just oppressed by the other professors who have the capacity, who lead the department, and have the capacity to impose restrictions on their speech. And what's interesting is that the whole premise is argued as if, well, the professor really doesn't owe his allegiance to the trustees of the university. They may write his they may sign his paycheck, but that's who he works for only, provisionally. But who he really works for, who the professor really serves the interests of, is society. And this is a sort of abstraction that prevents the professor from being constrained by anyone, because obviously he says, well, this is all sort of hypothetical, because we don't want a situation where the voters of California can fire a professor either. So the public, although the professors serve the professors aren't accountable to the public. They don't want the public to be able to vote in people who are going to turn around and use the state to impose certain norms on what the professors are and are not allowed to say. So in that sense, that they're not accountable to the public, right? They don't want to be accountable to anyone. They only want to be accountable to each other. The professors are only accountable to the group of professors. And right off the bat, you see that John Dewey's idea for what this is going to be is idealistic, and in practice, it doesn't turn out to be quite that way. It turns into exactly what he thought it wasn't going to be. And I think this is indicative a bit of John Dewey's naivety about the way things work. John Dewey lacks a sort of cynicism, and he elevates the professor and the academic and the scholar as somehow like above corruption, above groupthink, and that's just not true. The bureaucracy always forms, and there's just something unsavory about bureaucracy that manages to isolate itself from all outside influence, so that it's not accountable to anybody. It's not accountable to the universities, the administrators of the university. It's not accountable to the general public. It's not accountable to anybody. I think that generally speaking, we like, as Americans, we like to have some sort of accountability for institutions and bureaucracies, and not just let them just do whatever they want with no oversight at all. So, what is the correct solution? I don't know. It seems as though we're in a situation now where professors are afraid to speak their minds, and I think that they are afraid of administrations. I think the administration can make a professor's life very difficult, and I think that I don't know the extent to which this organization still exists, still advocates for academic freedom, but I suspect it doesn't do an awful lot. I suspect it's probably deeply captured by ideological leftists, and they would crack down on anybody trying to exercise their academic freedom in the wrong direction. I don't think that they would do an awful lot for a conservative professor, I suspect. But I don't know. I haven't looked into this organization, but I do know that academic freedom is a challenging issue, because professors really should be able to sort of say what they think is true, and at the same time, for professors to indoctrinate students with ideologies that are not true or that are destructive to society, with absolutely no capacity for anyone to provide any sort of oversight to pull them from the university, that they could just lodge themselves into our university system and there's no way to extract them. That doesn't quite seem right either. So I suppose it's a sort of unsolved riddle, how to go about maintaining academic freedom and still having some amount of public oversight as to what these professors are actually doing to our universities and to our students. So John Dewey's good. It's good that he advocated for academic freedom in that way, but I think it's also bad that he advocated for total lack of accountability. How to square that circle, I don't know the answer. I'm not a professor. I'm not in the university system, and that solution is probably going to have to come from someone other than me. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.